So good afternoon, my name is Bruce Lincoln. I'm a senior fellow here at CITI, and I'm also the co-founder of Silicon Harlem. But I'm also on the Mayor's Broadband Advisory Task Force. So what I want to do today is sort of wear two hats. So in the first part of my 10 minutes, I want to talk about what we're looking at from the standpoint of the Mayor's Office of broadband access and how we're focusing on issues of creating new jobs, creating a type of digital equity. And then I want to end by talking about some of the things that we're doing from the standpoint of Silicon Harlem. And you'll see how they all tie together and resonate across all these themes that we've been discussing over the last hour or so. So here in New York City at this point in time, tech is the second largest sector in the New York City economy. It's growing exponentially. But one of the issues that we are facing here is that the number of jobs outpaces the number of skilled workers that we can place in those jobs. Those jobs both have a STEM component, they also have a coding component. So we're faced in New York City within the context of a city of 5 boroughs where we're addressing income inequality, a skills gap, and thus an opportunity gap. So how do we, in essence, from the policy side, from the standpoint of the mayor's office, create equity and address those disparities, and how do we also address the need to create a STEM pipeline? We've seen a tremendous amount of growth in the tech startup sector. They're growing in Silicon Alley, they're growing in Digital Dumbo, and they're also growing locally here in Silicon Harlem. One of the things that we're finding is that there's an issue as far as the population that doesn't exist in this tech startup culture and the skills that they have. So I want to talk about a little bit now is this idea of disrupting workforce development. Oh, I don't have any slides. I have an old-fashioned but that's kind of key, collateral damage or benefits of the new economy. So what we're talking about here is inclusion. But if you look at the traditional way in which workforce development has been done in the city of New York, I believe it's at least a $500 million industry. We get monies from the federal government, and they re-up that contract and that funding every year. We get funding from the state, but there's always been a schism as far as workforce development. The workforce development is done through nonprofits who train people in all sorts of skills that actually have no relevance to the digital economy. And there's never any real connection to the companies and the corporations who have the jobs. And they've historically never been able to make that connection. Now what you're seeing is that the fastest growing companies, the startups such as Spotify or the large organizations such as Google, are growing to where they need computer savvy, computer skilled, full stack developers. If you're at RGA, you actually need not only full stack developers, you need people who can do user interface and user experience development. The breakdown is we're not producing those types of skilled persons through our school system. So the school system has begun to respond to that. They have a lot of programs as far as coding. You even have the growth of the Computer Science in New York City Foundation, which once again was sort of founded by Fred Wilson, the renowned VC, who's also on the Mayor's Task Force with myself, and Sarah Holloway, who's also a professor here in the School of International Public Affairs, creating a foundation that's funding the development of computer science programs in the schools. That's still in a limited number of schools, though it's growing. They have a meetup that is well attended. In fact, they're meeting on Saturday at Google and looking at those sorts of issues. But when you look at the larger scheme of things in a public school system of 1,000 schools, you don't have these programs in, I think, even 10% of those schools. You have also a growth of nonprofits that are starting to do computer coding. Girls Who Code, Black Girls Code. Silicon Harlem even has a program called the Apps Youth Leadership academy, but it's not really addressing the real future need that the city has when it not only looks at how do we make sure there are skilled workers in these companies, but how does the prosperity of those workers then broaden out and raise the level of prosperity in the outer boroughs. So what we're looking to address from the mayor's standpoint is two things. One, we see a correlation between do you have access to low-cost and affordable broadband? Not DSL, but broadband. So there are efforts to now drive that forward. And for the first time, and I believe the mayor announced this at the recent Internet Week conference, there's a commitment of $70 million where now in the budget we're looking at how to drive broadband out into the outer boroughs. That's also tied into a CFI, a call for innovation, where we are saying we want to hear from Jamaica, Queens, and Brownsville, Brooklyn, and Washington Heights, New York City, about ideas for how we can drive the internet out into those communities and make sure people begin to have access. Now, this is all in its early stages. This is, I think, 6 months in, and these are important advances on the standpoint of policy. And this is working both internally and externally. So not only are we trying to figure out ways to create efficiencies and create innovation outside based on these policies, they also have to address how do you create these efficiencies and create innovation across the different agencies. You do not have at this point sort of interagency cooperation. You don't have this type of an interagency network that basically says that the Department of Corrections is working in concert with Tech and Innovation or is working with the Department of Buildings. But what's very interesting is that there have begun those conversations to try to start to drive that and create this type of cultural change. So just in the same way you have to have this type of cultural change and management change within the context of corporations, we now have to have that within the context of a large bureaucracy such as the city of New York. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about as we think about jobs or work in the future, jobs and work are not necessarily going to be located within corporations. They're not necessarily going to be located within offices. And one of the things that you see here in New York is the rapid growth of co-working spaces. WeWork is sort of the behemoth that is growing rapidly, and that's a totally different type of work environment where it's like a carnival. You go in there and you can eat. You're working hard, but all of a sudden you're going to run into somebody when you're getting coffee who's doing something neat, and you're going to figure out how to connect with them. So it kind of drives this idea of innovation through inadvertence. You don't know what might happen based on the idea you have because you're meeting someone else and they've got an idea and you're starting to bring that together. So that's an important driver. That also requires highly capitalized environments, such as what we see with WeWork. And then on a smaller scale, you see that happening in Silicon Harlem. We now went, in a matter of 2 years, from 0 co-working spaces to 6 co-working spaces and respond to the types of entrepreneurs that are making themselves a part of this growing ecosystem. We now have 2 acceleration programs. And you see City College, Columbia has led in this area for some time now, going back to 2008 when I was here as an entrepreneur in residence. You now see City College starting to get involved in that, so that you're starting to get this ecosystem to emerge. And my co-founder, Clayton Banks, is here, who's been really driving a lot of this activity. But we see it focusing on 4 key areas when it comes to this idea of creating an ecosystem and creating ultimately what is driven by cultural change. And then I'm going to end by talking about how learning plays a role in all of this. One is the next generation internet. You have to have the next generation internet not simply to support the rapid growth of these tech startups and the ways in which they work and interact both locally and remotely, but because in this way you can bring up the rest of the community that's not tech. We know that for every tech job, we create 5 ancillary jobs. So there's a real driver here as far as economic development. The broad dissemination and the cultural growth of the innovation economy, where it's not simply I'm thinking about the next cool app that will take advantage of the fact that you have this broad-based adoption of the smartphones, but the rise of the social entrepreneur and social innovators who are really trying to disrupt how services that were initially deployed and delivered through nonprofits and now basically being delivered through other means. And then if you want to look at how you support the growth of our future leaders and our future populations, it looks at its idea of STEM literacy and STEM entrepreneurship. And there are a number of programs that have grown in that regard, but I want to talk in particular about the Apps Youth Leadership Academy, which is a Silicon Valley program that we've done in concert with the Caribbean Cultural Center as well as City College. And in that, working with sort of existing programs, the Department of Ed's Digital Readiness, Career Technical Education Program, as well as some nonprofits like Script Ed who go into the schools and train charter school students how to code, we've been able to put together a flagship that we think we can scale. And a year ago, what we did was we put out a call for applications. 70 students applied. These students range across actually a number of the schools that are already doing coding, so they brought in some of those skills. And what we did was we taught them how to build tech startups in 7 weeks. And what we found was that they could code, they could learn that rapidly, but the most important skills were sort of what we call more affective skills, and those that have to do with computational thinking and digital design. And what they picked up were the ability to work in teams. They had to form teams because they had to form companies. They had to basically be a working group, and they had to figure out how to address issues and differences. They learned logo design. But the big deal with each one of these students, we had them do a lot of pitching. So they each learned how to pitch about whom they were, what they were doing, what their product was they were working on, and they learned how to engage the community through surveys. That development, those affective skills, was very important when it came down to their being seniors. So one of the things we've seen is that they've done very well in terms of their ability to get accepted to colleges. Now, what the issue is, because there's still students coming from low-income communities, and we're working on solving that, working with, say, the United Negro College Fund, is how to make sure they have the money to go off to colleges. Some of them can get into the Smiths, and Smiths can pay for that. They subsidize these top students. So Princeton will pay for you fully. But when you go to some other schools, that's the issue. But the idea of looking at STEM development, STEM leadership early on, and then sort of developing these sorts of projects is very important. But what it gets into, which I told Bob was earlier going to be my title, but now I'm going to use it as my end kind of tagline, is this idea of disrupting the workforce development. So the idea is that we disrupt this idea that the technology is going to create a jobless future and use it to address the fact that if we deploy these advanced networks correctly, if we provision them with the right programs and services, we will actually create jobs. They won't exist in a normal building as they once did. They won't even maybe look like a 9-to-5 job, but there will be work, and it will be tied into individuals who we will skill along the entire spectrum of their development. Thank you.